Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. In this episode, we talk with philosopher Christian List about a different way of responding to a challenge to free will from physics. Even if determinism is true at the level of physics, free will might still be possible at the higher and independent level of agency.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Christian List, professor of philosophy and decision theory at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Christian's work has explored the nature of decision-making, both individual and collective, and he's written several articles and recently a book focusing on free will. The book is called Why Free Will is Real, and it was published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. The book is well written, and you don't need a PhD in philosophy to understand the arguments. And since many of our questions we'll ask about aspects of this book, if this interview piques your interest, we'd encourage listeners to check out the book. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Christian. Welcome to the show. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Yeah, so hi, thanks very much for having me on your show. It's great to be on the program today. So my background, I grew up in a small town in rural Germany, and then I went to Oxford to study mathematics and philosophy, and developed an interest not just in theoretical philosophy, but also in more practical areas of philosophy, especially political philosophy. And that motivated me to go on to do a PhD in political science or politics. And I specialized in the area of social choice theory. So basically the formal study of collective decision procedures, collective decision mechanisms. And that then also became one of my main areas of specialization for a very long time. So I started out my career working in a political science department at the London School of Economics and teaching initially primarily within political science and political theory. But then over the years found myself getting drawn more and more back into philosophy. So step by step, more and more of my work ended up focusing on more theoretical questions in philosophy again. And I mean, over the course of my career, I've done a lot of work on all sorts of questions related to decision-making, both decision-making in individuals and also in groups. And I think anyone who studies decision-making will at some point face the question of free will. I mean, after all, it seems on the face of it, some notion of free will or freedom of choice is implicit in the conventional understanding of decision making, and I actually also think it's implicit in much of decision theory in its contemporary form. Although this is perhaps an assumption that is not so clearly acknowledged by most or by many practitioners of decision theory. And so all of this was a background for my interest in free will. And initially it was a bit of a hobby interest that I pursued, but then I also developed a line of joint work on mental causation with my friend, the late Peter Menzies, and we wrote several articles together on issues related to mental causation, and various pieces came together. And at one point, I felt that I had a sort of picture of free will in my mind that I wanted to defend, and so that's how I ended up in this current place.
Yeah, cool. So one of the questions we usually start out with when we have an interview is about terminology. So what do you take free will to involve?
Yes. Of course, from a very conventional day-to-day perspective, free will is simply the ability to choose and control our own actions. But slightly more precisely, I think free will is a three-part capacity. So it involves or requires, first of all, intentional agency. Only systems or entities that are intentional agents are even candidates for having free will. So I've got a water bottle in front of me that's it's clearly not an intentional agent,
Yeah.
and it's not even a candidate for having free will. Secondly, there is the capacity for choice between alternative possibilities, or for short alternative possibilities. I take that also to be an important requirement of free will. And then finally, some form of causal control over our actions, or mental causation, that also for me is a key requirement for free will. Now, some people define free will perhaps in somewhat less demanding ways. So many free will compatibilists omit the alternative possibilities requirement from this list. But I think that this would amount to a somewhat watered down notion of free will. So intuitively, at least, I am very much with the libertarians who think that choice between alternative possibilities is really an essential prerequisite for free will. And that's why my list of requirements for free will is a little bit more demanding than the standard compatibilist one. So in short, intentional agency, alternative possibilities, and causal control are the three requirements for free will.
Nice, thanks. In your book, you address three scientifically motivated challenges for free will: the challenge from radical materialism, the challenge from determinism, and the challenge from epiphenomenalism. We'll probably focus more on the challenge from determinism than the others, but could you briefly describe each of the three challenges for us?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, I think that there are these three requirements for free will. And now each of these challenges targets one of the three requirements and basically suggests that the relevant property or condition is just not compatible with a scientific worldview, or not supported by a scientific worldview. So let's begin with a challenge from radical materialism. I suggest that free will requires intentional agency. According to the challenge from radical materialism, intentional agency is an old-fashioned folk notion left over from earlier days in which we didn't really have sophisticated neuroscience. And on this picture, the understanding of humans as intentional agents will be replaced by a more reductionistic neuroscientific understanding of humans, or biological understanding of humans, essentially as biophysical machines. And on such an understanding of humans, we wouldn't need to ever use intentional notions. We wouldn't need to ascribe intentional states to agents. We wouldn't even make use of the whole paradigm of intentional explanation, but we do everything at a sub-intentional physical or neuroscientific level. And then it would seem that the whole notion of intentional agency drops out of the picture, and the idea that humans are intentional agents as opposed to mere biophysical systems would no longer seem to be supported by such a worldview. I mean, that's the kind of radical materialistic picture that you find in the work of neurophilosophers such as Patricia and Paul Churchland, for instance. It's also known under the name of, for instance, eliminativist materialism. And so it's clear that if you subscribe to that general approach, then, I mean, you'd not just deny intentional agency as a sort of phenomenon in a scientific worldview, but you then also have to deny free will, at least on the understanding of free will that I began with. So that's the challenge from radical materialism. The challenge from determinism is the one that's been discussed the most in the philosophical literature. This is simply the point that if the physical universe is deterministic, so that the initial conditions under the laws of nature completely fix the entire trajectory of subsequent physical states of the universe, then it seems that there's no room for choice between alternative possibilities in such a universe. And then if alternative possibilities are required for free will, there'd be no room for free will. This challenge was made almost famously developed in a sophisticated way, for instance, in Peter van Inwagen's consequence argument. And it's been much discussed. And then finally, the challenge from epiphenomenalism targets the causal control or mental causation requirement for free will. So here, the problem is simply that if we take seriously something like the causal exclusion argument that has been carefully developed by scholars such as Jaegwon Kim, then it seems that there is no room for genuine mental causation in a physical universe unless you're willing to identify mental states with underlying physical brain states. But if we have independent good reasons to think that mental states, while perhaps supervenient on physical brain states, are nonetheless distinct from those physical brain states, then this kind of argument would basically knock out the causal efficacy of mental states. And so mental states would be a mere epiphenomenon. They would let's say the mental states, for instance, the intentional states of an agent, they would be byproducts of various underlying physical processes. These underlying physical processes would also be causally responsible for the various resulting actions or behaviors. But the mental states, the intentions to which we normally attribute the resulting actions, they wouldn't really do any causal work. And so once again, if you think that some form of genuine causal control that the agent has over the resulting actions or mental causation is needed for free will, then this kind of argument would undermine free will. There are also neuroscientific versions of this kind of challenge, which you find in the Libet experiments, for instance, where, again, the claim is that the conscious intentions to perform certain actions are allegedly just byproducts or epiphenomena, but not really the causal source. And much has been written about these, and I won't rehearse the arguments again. But these, I think, are three really key scientifically motivated challenges for free will that we find in the recent debate.
Yeah, cool. Well, key to your responses to each of these challenges for free will is the idea that there's different levels of description of reality. So there's an important difference, you say, between lower level description at the level of physics and higher level description at the level of agency. So could you explain these different levels and why you take free will to be a higher level phenomenon?
Yes, so maybe I should begin with the notion of levels. We use many different sciences to make sense of different phenomena in the world. And these sciences all have somewhat different domains of inquiry. And crucially, they also use different concepts and categories in their explanations. Let's say explanations in fundamental physics refer to particles, fields, and forces. Explanations in chemistry invoke various chemical concepts and notions. In biology, we've got cells and organisms and ecosystems. And then in psychology or in the social sciences, we have the entire intentional idiom. We make use of intentional explanations and not just causal ones, again, employing a whole different range of concepts and categories. So that's, I think, just a fact about scientific practice. And now, I think it's then useful to distinguish between different phenomena and also between different facts and properties in the world based on the level of description that we employ to make sense of those phenomena or facts or properties. And so a physical level fact, for instance, at the level of fundamental physics, is one which we can refer to using the concepts and categories of fundamental physics. A biological level fact is one that we refer to using the concepts and categories of biology, and so on. So let's say a psychological level fact or a psychological level property is one that we refer to using the concepts and categories of psychology. Now, reductionists might think that, whenever we employ higher level concepts and categories, this is really just a shorthand for something that we could equally say in, for instance, fundamental physical terms. Maybe it'd be more complicated, but that's a sort of near practical matter. But I think that there are some very powerful arguments for the, at least in practice, if not in principle, irreducibility of various higher level descriptions and higher level explanations to lower level ones. Now, if we accept this, and if we are convinced by those kinds of arguments for a non-reductive picture of the world, where there are perhaps supervenience relations between different levels, but not relations of reducibility, then I think it makes sense to really take the leveled nature of the world, quite seriously and quite literally as an important feature of the reality that we find ourselves in. And crucially for me, and that's something that I've defended elsewhere, especially in a paper on levels, descriptive, explanatory, and ontological, I think that levels are not merely a descriptive phenomenon that has to do with the nature of our descriptions and the nature of our explanations, but rather, I think the fact that we use these different levels of description, different levels of explanation, is sort of indicative of a particular leveled structure of the world itself, and that therefore a leveled ontology is also philosophically quite defensible. Okay, so that's the sort of general point about levels. Mm-hmm. Now, if you consider different phenomena that we might want to study, it becomes evident that, let's say if you want to talk about the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics, then it's best to use the concepts and categories of quantum mechanics to make sense of all of this. But if we want to speak about some phenomena in ecology, for instance, then it's not at all clear that we'd want to use the descriptions of fundamental physics to make sense of it, but rather we'd use the appropriate higher level descriptions from biology or ecology. And now when we turn to phenomena to do with human psychology, so for instance, the phenomenon of intentional agency in humans, it's evident that we need to make use of psychological concepts and categories where we can refer, for instance, to intentions, to cognition, to various psychological processes in order to make sense of all of this. Fundamental physics, or even the sort of neuroscience that understands the brain primarily as a biophysical system, would not be quite appropriate for this. I mean, that might be appropriate for making sense of some of the biological or physical machinery that the human body uses to implement or instantiate this phenomenon of intentional agency. But that's not quite the same as accounting for the phenomenon of intentional agency itself. So intentional agency, therefore, I suggest, is very much a higher level phenomenon, a psychological level phenomenon, which requires the use of psychological descriptions. And insofar as free will and choice and causal control and indeed also something like rational decision making, insofar as these are all things that take place at the level of intentional agency rather than at the level of physical machines, it's therefore entirely appropriate to say that free will is also a higher level phenomenon. We'd also not ask, for instance, whether a purely physical system understood in physical level terms has beliefs, desires, and intentions. We ask whether an intentional agent understood in psychological terms has beliefs, desires, and intentions. And so likewise, it's really the intentional agent who is the potential bearer of free will qua intentional agent, and not the underlying body qua physical system. I mean, the underlying body qua physical system will instantiate the intentional agent via a complicated psychological mechanism that leads to the emergence of intentional agency as a higher level phenomenon. And it's of course super exciting that this is possible and something that we need to study and understand. But the property of free will really pertains to the intentional agent rather than any underlying physical system. And so that's the sense in which I think free will is a higher level phenomenon.
Nice. Suppose that the physicists and cosmologists were to discover that our world is deterministic in the sense that determinism obtains at the level of physics. You agree that at that lower level of description, determinism precludes alternative possibilities, yet you think that free will requires alternative possibilities. So how could we have free will if determinism's true?
Yes. So one key point to note here is that the distinction between determinism and indeterminism itself, I think, is best understood as a level-specific distinction. So my claim is that it doesn't make that much sense to ask, is the world deterministic or indeterministic simpliciter? That question, strictly speaking, is not fully well defined, fully well specified as yet. For the question to become fully well specified, we need to be clear about the level at which we are referring to the world here. Are we describing the world at a fundamental physical level? Are we describing the world at some more macroscopic level, for instance, the level associated with some special science, and so on? Now, even if a system is deterministic at a lower level, when, for instance, the system's state space is understood in a very, very fine-grained way, it can still be the case that once you redescribe the system at a higher level, at which the higher level state space of the system becomes more coarse-grained due to supervenience and multiple realizability, the resulting higher level system displays indeterministic dynamics. So here you'd have a kind of, metaphorically speaking, a kind of phase transition from deterministic lower level dynamics to indeterministic higher level dynamics as a byproduct of coarse graining or coarser redescription of the world. In fact, I should note that the reverse is also possible. So you could have a system that displays indeterministic lower level dynamics and at the same time deterministic higher level dynamics. So the bottom line here is deterministic dynamics at one particular level, whether lower or higher, does not imply deterministic dynamics at other levels. So even a sort of leveled hierarchy in which of systems in which you've got deterministic dynamics at even-numbered levels and indeterministic dynamics at odd-numbered levels is actually a completely coherent possibility, albeit perhaps a somewhat far-fetched one of a thought experiment. And in fact, my colleague Marcus Pivato and I have a technical result to this effect in a 2015 Phil review paper on emergent chance on precisely this point. Now, if we accept that the distinction between determinism and indeterminism is a level-specific distinction, then this opens the door to the possibility that you could have deterministic dynamics in fundamental physics, and you could have indeterministic dynamics at the level of agency, at the level of psychology. And earlier on, I emphasized that we should think of free will as a higher level property, and we should also think of the three prerequisites for free will: intentional agency, alternative possibilities, and causal control as higher level properties. And so therefore, the notion of alternative possibilities that we're looking for when we're trying to defend free will is a higher level notion of alternative possibilities. It's alternative possibilities at the level of agency, alternative choice possibilities for an agent, qua agent that matter, not alternative microphysical trajectories of a physical system qua physical system. And so what we need for free will is what I call agential level indeterminism, rather than physical level indeterminism. And at least in principle, as I've just argued, agential level indeterminism can coexist with physical level determinism. I mean, again, the devil is in the detail. Yeah. Much would then depend on exactly what the nature of the many-to-one supervenience relation is that takes from physical states to agential states. But insofar as our best theories of agency, I think, support a picture of agency in which there is agential level indeterminism, where agents are confronted with genuine choice nodes or branching points in their agential histories. I actually think that we've not just got this compatibility result here based on the level-specific nature of the determinism-indeterminism distinction, but we've also got independent support for agential indeterminism from some of our best special sciences that deal with the phenomenon of agency. And so that's the sense in which I think we can have free will, even if physical level determinism is true. What we cannot have is free will in the presence of agential level determinism. So should we ever get a radically different theory of psychology, which entails that even at the level of psychology, human beings are entirely deterministic machines, then that would indeed put pressure on my defense of free will.
Yeah. Well, you call your view compatibilist libertarianism, so maybe this is a good segue to when you were talking about the different levels. Now we can talk about terminology. So in previous seasons, we've defined these terms in such a way that compatibilist libertarian sounds like a contradiction. One component of libertarianism is the thesis of incompatibilism. So how do we use what you've been saying so far to describe how one could be a compatibilist libertarian?
Yes, so I totally take your point that at first sight this label sounds like a contradiction in terms. So I need to unpack the label a little bit in order to explain why I nonetheless think it's a good label and a justified one for the position that I'm defending here. First of all, I want to emphasize that there is an important sense in which my account of free will has a libertarian structure. So my account of free will is libertarian in the sense that it says that free will requires alternative possibilities for choice, and that it requires not just alternative possibilities in some kind of watered down sense, for instance, uh, in a conditional sense, using certain counterfactuals, but it requires alternative possibilities in a modal sense that includes indeterminism at the level of agency. So at the level of agency, I sort of agree with what the libertarians would say, namely free will requires a form of indeterminism. And it just so happens that I emphasize that what it requires is indeterminism at the level of agency rather than some version of indeterminism simpliciter. If you had a, let's say, flat picture of the world, a sort of one-level ontology, then indeterminism at the level of agency would presumably be the same as indeterminism simpliciter, insofar as we wouldn't be distinguishing between different levels. And then if we had this flat picture, then then my account of free will would really look very, very similar to the libertarian one. So again, to recap, my account really does require indeterminism at the level of agency as a prerequisite for free will, and that's very much a libertarian feature. So if we were to sort of somehow truncate this hierarchy of levels that I mentioned and only focus on the level of agency alone and just ignore everything else, then I think the libertarians and I would be likely to be in agreement about the architecture of what free will requires. And so that's the libertarianism. Now, the compatibilist qualification in my label, compatibilist libertarianism, comes from the fact that this version of libertarianism that I defend, according to which free will requires agential level indeterminism, is nonetheless compatible with determinism at the level of fundamental physics. So that's the sort of sense in which my view also has a compatibilist flavor. But the compatibilism is a kind of inter-level compatibilism. So you've got a sort of libertarian picture at the level of agency, but I suggest that that's compatible with a deterministic picture at the level of fundamental physics. So that's a kind of inter-level compatibility here. On the other hand, if we just focus on my theory from an intra-level perspective, and you just consider the agential level alone, then this account of free will has very much a libertarian structure. And so if you put these two things together, we get the label compatibilist libertarianism.
Thanks. Well, this is sort of a follow-up question to what you were just saying, but yours is obviously a novel and very interesting view of free will. Could you say a bit about what it has in common, if anything, with other views of free will that are out there?
Yes, yeah. So the view obviously has a number of precursors, and one precursor in particular can be found in the work of Anthony Kenny. So back in the 1970s, already he defended free will by invoking a distinction between different levels, namely what he called a physiological level on the one hand and then a psychological level on the other hand. And so I think he very much recognized that this two-level architecture would help us reconcile free will with determinism. But this view, for some reason, has been perhaps somewhat overlooked or underappreciated in the free will debate. It's nowhere near as influential as many other compatibilist positions. but also, I think he never quite provided more precise, let's say, technical analysis of how this leveled picture would work and how these levels hang together. So I think it kind of left some important questions open, and at the core of my account is a more formal analysis of this multi-level structure, including the general point that determinism and indeterminism are very much level-specific phenomena. So Kenny is really one precursor I'd like to mention and recognize here. Yeah. Another precursor can also be found in Dennett's works. Dennett, especially in this book Freedom Evolves, also defended the idea that even if you've got determinism in the underlying physical system, this doesn't render everything inevitable at the level of agency. Right. So then it introduces this notion of evitability. Things can be evitable for agents or decision makers, even if you've got some underlying deterministic dynamics. But I think there was a sense in which perhaps, while presenting this in a sort of very attractive and imaginative and way, it's perhaps not been pinpointed fully precisely what he meant there. And so there was a time when I, because I obviously got quite very much inspired by Dennett's writings, as many people have been inspired by Dennett. And there was a time, perhaps 10 years ago or longer, when I thought that I was sort of elaborating a version of Dennett's view. But then I had discussions with people, and each time I tried to explain what I then took to be my kind of reconstruction of Dennett's view, people pointed out to me that couldn't really be what Dennett meant, or they kind of maybe projected onto my account various other aspects of Dennett's views that I didn't share, or perhaps Dennett subtly changed his position from one place to another. Right. And so for this reason, I thought that while very much acknowledging my kind of intellectual debt to Dennett's works, it would be best to just develop this whole picture in a separate, independent and freestanding way. But clearly this is another precursor. You'll find. At the end of the day, I suppose even the entire Kantian tradition, in which physical phenomena on the one hand and agential ones are distinguished from one another, and I'd also be perfectly happy to place my account of free will in the context of that tradition.
Yeah,
great,
very interesting. So, what would be? You've defended this view for a few years now. What would be the objection that pops up when you're defending the view that keeps you up at night?
Well, does it keep me up at night? But anyway, I mentioned an objection that comes up again and again. So maybe that's the objection that should keep me up at night. A very common objection is that I only managed to establish a form of alternative possibilities in an epistemic sense, but not really in an ontic sense. So the objection basically says it may very well be true that determinism at the level of fundamental physics can coexist with unpredictability at the level of agency or at some other higher level, simply because when we engage in higher level description, we lack complete information about the detailed underlying physical microstate. And it is in light of this incomplete information about the microstate that we are then not able to fully predict the trajectory of the world, thereby getting the illusion of alternative possibilities, but it's nothing more than that. Mm-hmm. So in short, this objection would say what I call agential level indeterminism is at best some form of epistemic unpredictability, but it's not a genuine form of indeterminism. And so to respond to that objection, I need to argue that we should interpret higher level indeterminism ontically and not just epistemically. And my general strategy for making this point is to, in effect, endorse and what is to endorse a naturalistic approach to ontology quite generally. So I think that in any given domain of inquiry, we should take the descriptions given to us by our best scientific theories in that domain at face value. I mean, assuming at least those theories are empirically adequate, sufficiently mature, and there are no other strong reasons that speak against taking those theories seriously. Right. So if our best scientific theories of let's say biology say there truly are organisms, or we make reference to organisms, for instance, or make reference to genetic inheritance or phenomena such as random mutation or whatever it might be, then we should take that at face value. Or likewise, whenever our best theories in the social sciences commit us to postulating that there are certain institutions, let's say, or organizations that themselves play a causal role in the world, then once again we should take this at face value. And in line with this naturalistic approach to ontology, I think that when our best scientific theories of a particular domain suggest that the phenomena in that domain display an indeterministic dynamics, then we should also take that at face value and be realists about this postulated domain-specific indeterminism. And now I think there are very good reasons to conclude that our best theories of decision-making actually presuppose agential level indeterminism insofar as postulating non-singleton option sets is absolutely essential for the activity of intentional explanation. I'm also inclined to take that at face value and then be realist about the agential indeterminism that is posited by our best scientific theories of agency and decision making. And so that's the reason why I would push for an ontic interpretation of the appropriate higher level indeterminism and not merely an epistemic one. And that's why at the end of the day, I'm not moved by the objection, even though, of course, I understand that thought that is behind that objection.
Mm-hmm. I have a quick follow-up thought on that. So if there's real indeterminacy, ontic, not just epistemic alternative possibilities at the level of agency, do you think that makes the view vulnerable to the luck objection to libertarianism? We interviewed Al Mealy about the problem of luck for our first season. I think he's actually raised this point in connection with your view before. I was just curious what you think about that.
Yes, so insofar as my account of free will is similar to other libertarian accounts, at least when we restrict our attention to the level of agency alone, it's also vulnerable to some similar objections. So I do agree that in principle, my view also faces this luck objection, and I need to be able to say something systematic in response to that objection. I mean, in my book, I have a discussion of that, and I mean, just to sort of cut a long story short, I think that two things can be simultaneously true. It can be the case that I have several different options ahead of me as an agent, between which I, as an agent, could choose. So I have multiple agential possibilities ahead of me, and then I choose one of these options, and let's suppose I'm at least approximately rational in this context. So it so happens that I really do choose the option that I intentionally endorse, which is in line with my beliefs, desires, intentions, and so on. Now, in this case, the following things can be true at the same time. It can be true that I chose this particular option. My mental state also was the difference-making cause of that choice. Moreover, that choice is rationalized by my underlying intentional states. And so in that sense, there is something very non-arbitrary about that choice. And yet, it was agentially possible for me to act otherwise. And since all of this can be simultaneously true, I suggest that the mere fact that I had alternative possibilities does not render my choice merely a matter of luck or randomization at all. So perhaps, I mean, my view might be a little bit better placed even to answer that luck objection than traditional libertarian views, at least some traditional libertarian views, especially the kinds of libertarian views that draw on phenomena such as quantum randomness in order to introduce indeterminism into the world. They might be somewhat more vulnerable to this objection. I mean, Robert Kane has a sophisticated response to that objection from his perspective, which is, you know, a very, very clever response. But it's not the response that I myself would endorse. But insofar as the source of the indeterminism that is involved in free will on my picture is nothing like quantum randomness or nothing like randomness at all, but the source is rather option availability for an intentional agent. I actually think there is a sense in which my view is less vulnerable to this objection than other views. But I should also note that I developed a slightly more elaborate version of that response in a joint paper on alternative possibilities and intentional endorsement that I wrote with Wlodek Rabinowitz, in which we present a slightly more detailed version of the set of points that I just very quickly summarized here.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, thanks for letting me ask that follow-up question.
Well, this whole season of the Free Will Show has been about free will and science, and we've been asking everybody that we interview to make a prediction. So we were wondering if you would be willing to make a prediction of where you think that there's going to be interesting developments or areas of science that would be most fruitful for philosophers interested in free will to explore.
Yeah, so I mean, personally, I think that the question of how exactly our scientific theories of agency and decision making rely upon certain presuppositions of indeterminism and how precisely this can be spelled out. I personally think that those are some very interesting questions at the overlap between the free will debate on the one hand and the relevant special sciences on the other hand. I mean, I'm actually very intrigued by a metaphysical theory that Helen Stewart has developed and defended in recent years, which I think she calls agency incompatibilism.
Yeah.
This is the view that there's not just an incompatibility between free will and determinism, but there is an incompatibility between agency itself and indeterminism. And I'm kind of quite sympathetic to Stewart's view. I think, though, she develops this view more in the spirit of a classic libertarian approach with a maybe one level on ontology. I don't know whether she put it exactly in those terms, but the indeterminism that Stewart takes to be required for agency is indeterminism simpliciter, and I assume this would also require indeterminism within the fundamental physical laws of nature. Right. Whereas, I would perhaps be inclined to defend a version of agency incompatibilism as well, but a slightly different version of it, namely one that says that intentional agency, at least of a non-trivial sort, is incompatible with determinism at the level of agency. So it's agential indeterminism that is a prerequisite for agency, but not a physical indeterminism.
Interesting.
But I think this whole debate around agency incompatibilism raises some very interesting questions for, in fact, all of the sciences that address the phenomenon of agency, namely the question of how, according to these sciences, the phenomenon of agency fits into the rest of the world, and which particular metaphysical assumptions, if any, we need to make in order for agency to be possible. If I'm right, then the question of whether the fundamental laws of nature are deterministic or indeterministic is sort of orthogonal to any issue about agency. But whether agential indeterminism is true is really very much at the heart of the matter. Yeah. And so my hypothesis is that at least on a sort of realist understanding, our best theories of agency do indeed presuppose agential indeterminism, but that's something that I'd also like to explore further from the relevant special science perspective, and I'd very much welcome exploration of it. And maybe related to this, there's another area of the relevant sciences that is also somewhat underexplored. I think I mentioned this already at the beginning. While there is a vast body of work in the area of decision theory, and not just normative decision theory, but also decision theory as a descriptive and explanatory exercise. So that's decision theory of the sort that is being used in many of the social sciences. Mm-hmm. We find that in economics, we find it in various branches of psychology, but also in other branches of the social sciences. And there's actually really, surprisingly little discussion of what, if any, assumptions about free will are being made when we engage in decision theoretic modeling or in decision theoretic explanation. And again, if I'm right, realism about decision theory sort of presupposes a kind of realism about free will as well. But I'd also like to see more exploration of this to either maybe vindicate this hypothesis or perhaps refute it. I'd also find it very exciting if someone could develop a sort of alternative competing interpretation of decision theory that makes good philosophical sense of decision theory even as an explanatory exercise, and that is at least somewhat realist about decision theory, but which does not require any sort of assumption of free will and alternative possibilities.
Yeah.
So I think there is really a big terrain of open issues out there to be explored.
Yeah. Cool.
Nice. Well, thanks again so much for joining us, Christian. Where can listeners who are interested in your work go to follow what you're working on?
Well, they could go to my webpage, which is at christianlist.net. But more broadly, I mean, I myself am not on social media, but people interested in our center here in Munich, the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, could follow the MCMP on Twitter and see the announcements of our various activities here in Munich.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks again for joining us, Christian.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. This concludes our season on free will and science. Join us in the winter and spring of 2022 for interviews with early career scholars who specialize in free will. Unlike earlier seasons, we won't have a single theme for the next set of episodes. Instead, we'll ask these early scholars to talk about whatever they happen to be working on, and it should be a lot of fun.